Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. Liam Harper had barely made it. As the train's doors hissed shut, he slammed his palm against the metal, feeling the cold shock through his hand as the train jerked forward. The station was already far behind, its flickering lights growing smaller with every passing second. His heart raced, not just from the rush of getting on the last train home, but from a lingering unease he couldn't shake off. The station had been dimly lit, the overhead fluorescent lights flickering like faulty memories. Posters peeled off the walls, the once vibrant advertisements now faded relics of something forgotten. The cold, damp air carried a subtle but pervasive scent of mildew, a sharp contrast to the heat of the day that still clung to his skin. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a few tired souls hunched against the walls, clutching their bags. Liam didn't stop to observe them. He had seen their kind before, the weary commuters who found themselves on the wrong side of the clock, waiting for trains that never seemed to arrive. As he rushed past them, he caught the odd glint of the station name, an old, rusted sign that was too worn to make out any readable text. But there was no time for reflection. Liam's feet pounded against the cracked tiles as he hurried toward the train, its engine rumbling in the distance. He reached the platform just as the final call echoed across the speakers. The doors of the train were already half shut when he made a final desperate sprint and slipped inside. The car was as run down as the station. The air was thick, laden with the scent of rust and something else. Something faintly musty, as though the train had been abandoned for a long time. The seats were cracked leather, some worn down to the foam inside, and the ceiling sagged in places. The train had an unmistakable age to it, like an old piece of furniture you tried to restore but never quite succeeded. Liam was about to take a seat when he noticed the conductor. The man was standing at the end of the car, dressed in an outdated uniform, his face a mask of solemn indifference. He avoided Liam's gaze as he moved down the aisle, stamping tickets with mechanical precision, the clack of the ink hitting the paper echoing unnervingly in the silent car. The conductor's eyes were glassy, distant, as though he had seen everything there was to see on this train, and nothing mattered any more. Liam shuffled past him and sank into an empty seat, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He stared out the window, the station slowly fading from view, and noticed, with a chill creeping over him, that the station name on the platform sign was already unreadable. It was as though the place didn't exist anymore, the train carrying him far from what he knew. He let out a quiet sigh, trying to push the feeling from his mind. There was nothing unusual about late-night trains, nothing to worry about. But then, as the train picked up speed, he heard a voice. "You don't know where this train goes, do you?" Liam looked up. The woman sitting across from him had her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. She was in her early 30s, with a worn backpack strapped tightly to her back, her fingers gripping it as though it was her only lifeline. Liam smiled awkwardly. "It's just the last train to the city," he said, his voice unsure, though he already had the nagging feeling that this train wasn't going to be like any other ride home. She gave a small, nervous laugh. "It's not about where it's going," she whispered, leaning forward, her voice barely audible above the clattering of the train. "It's about when it stops." Liam blinked, unsure of how to respond. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, a voice from the back of the car interrupted him. "The train never really stops. Not for us." The man sitting near the back was older, his clothes dusty, the sleeves of his coat rolled up to reveal hands stained with charcoal. He was hunched over, scribbling feverishly on a piece of yellowed paper. Liam couldn't quite see what he was drawing, but there was something about it, a sense of decay, of something long past its time. The woman, Sophia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Don't listen to him," she muttered, her eyes darting toward the man. He's been here too long." But the older man only chuckled softly. "Longer than you can imagine, sweetheart," he murmured. "Longer than you can imagine." Liam shifted in his seat, his unease growing. He hadn't noticed before, but now that he was looking closely, there was something unsettling about the car's interior. The ceiling sagged, the wallpaper peeling at the edges like old, forgotten skin. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and the rattling of the train seemed to shake the walls in ways that didn't feel normal. It was as if the train itself was alive, but not in a way that made him feel safe. The sensation of being carried somewhere distant, somewhere out of time, only grew stronger as the minutes passed. Liam glanced back at Sophia, her face pale in the dim light. "When does this train stop?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, her fingers still gripping her bag. "It never does," she said softly. "Not for us." The train's motion suddenly felt more pronounced. The rocking of the car made it harder to stay still, and a dull headache began to form behind Liam's eyes. He tried to relax, but the oppressive feeling settled deeper in his chest. Outside the window, the world had begun to blur, as if they were no longer passing through familiar places. There was no familiar city skyline or flicker of streetlights, only endless darkness, stretching out into nothingness. And the train kept moving. Liam's thoughts swirled, trying to make sense of the strange conversation. What did Sophia mean by "when it stops"? And why was the old man, Walter, speaking as if the train was more than just a mode of transportation? His mind raced, but every attempt to rationalize the situation only left him feeling more uneasy. The train creaked as it accelerated, and Liam caught sight of the other passengers. There were only a handful, all of them sitting in strange silence. Aside from Sophia and Walter, there was a man at the front of the car, hunched over a small suitcase, staring blankly out the window. A woman near the door appeared to be asleep, her head resting against the glass. She didn't seem disturbed by the rattling of the train or the unsettling air. Liam turned back to Sophia, who was now tapping her foot nervously. Her eyes flickered toward Walter, then back to Liam. "You don't understand," she whispered again, barely audible. "It's not about the destination, but the time. Time gets lost here." Liam frowned. "What do you mean? Time? We're just headed home." Sophia's face hardened, her eyes darting around as if she was searching for something she couldn't quite find. She seemed to pull further into herself, clutching her backpack as though it was a shield. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I've been on this train before," she said, her words thick with dread. "I tried to get off, at the wrong stop." Liam's stomach clenched. "What happened?" "I didn't realize it at first," she continued, her voice trembling. "But when you get off at the wrong station, there's no way back. You'll be stuck." Walter, who had been scribbling on his paper with feverish intensity, suddenly interrupted. His voice was low and rough, almost a growl. "It doesn't matter where you get off," he muttered, eyes fixed on his drawing. "You'll find yourself back here. Always back here." Liam couldn't process it. The train rattled again, the lights above flickering once more. The feeling of time stretching and warping around him grew stronger. He glanced at the other passengers. They didn't seem concerned by the strange atmosphere. They sat there, frozen in time, as if they'd been here for ages. Trying to distract himself, Liam glanced out the window. The scenery had shifted, but not in a way he could recognize. There was no city skyline, no familiar landmarks, just an endless stretch of fog. The faint glow of streetlights pierced through the mist, but they appeared to be moving too quickly to be real. It was as though the landscape outside was shifting, distorting with every passing moment. Liam's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out eagerly, hoping to find some sort of connection to reality. He checked the screen. A message from his friend. "You getting home soon?" He frowned. The message was from hours ago. At least it seemed that way. The clock on his phone had reset itself, the time frozen in place, as though the hours between now and then hadn't happened at all. It was as though the minutes, the seconds, the very passage of time itself had been swallowed by the train. Sophia's voice cut through the silence again. "It's happening," she whispered. "You'll see it too." Liam looked up sharply, meeting her gaze. "See what?" She shook her head, her eyes wide and pleading. "The station. When it comes, you'll see what I mean." Before he could ask her what she was talking about, the train slowed abruptly, the screech of the brakes echoing down the empty car. The sudden stop sent a shock through Liam's chest, making him hold his breath for a moment. He glanced toward the conductor, who stood at the end of the car, his eyes fixed firmly on the door. "Next stop," the conductor said mechanically, as though reading from a script. Liam stood, his legs unsteady as he walked toward the door, his curiosity piqued. Sophia's warning echoed in his mind, but he couldn't help himself. He had to see what lay ahead. The train stopped with a final jolt, and the doors hissed open. The station outside was eerily silent. The platform was dimly lit by broken lights, and the sign above was cracked and unreadable. The air smelled thick with something damp and ancient, as though it had been forgotten for years. Liam stepped closer to the door, peering out into the dense fog. The platform stretched out in both directions, but there was no movement, no sign of life. He stepped out tentatively, his foot meeting the cold concrete. As he did, he caught sight of something. Figures, shadowy and unnatural, boarding the train. Their movements were jerky, their steps awkward and stiff. There was something distinctly wrong about them, something that made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand on end. Sophia appeared at his side, her face pale. "Don't go out there," she whispered urgently. "It's not safe." But before Liam could respond, the conductor appeared at his side, blocking his way. His cold eyes met Liam's, unblinking. "Bess, stay on the train," he said in a voice that held no room for argument. "This isn't your stop." Liam's heart raced. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave, to escape the station. The figures outside seemed to draw closer, their motions becoming more erratic, and yet he couldn't move. Sophia checked her watch nervously, her fingers trembling. "I need to get off," she muttered. "I can't stay here." Walter's voice rang out from behind them, his laugh bitter. "She doesn't know. None of them do." Liam turned back to face him, but the man had already gone quiet. His attention returned to his drawing. His hands were stained with charcoal, the paper in front of him filled with disturbing sketches of the train, a version of it that looked decayed, broken, abandoned. The train lurched again, and the doors slid shut with a final metallic clang. The landscape outside blurred once more as the train began to move again, taking them further into the unknown. Liam's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes wide as he watched the station slip into the distance, disappearing behind the thickening fog. The muffled hum of the train's engine and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks were the only sounds that filled the air. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant, unreachable. He looked over at Sophia, but her face was a mask of worry. "I told you," she murmured, her voice distant. "There's no way back once you step off at the wrong stop. You'll never leave." Liam's mind raced. What did she mean by never leave? And why had the station looked so wrong? His thoughts spun around, trying to grasp at something solid in the sea of confusion. The train car was quieter now. Most of the other passengers remained motionless, their eyes blank, their expressions unreadable. The woman at the door was still asleep, her face pressed against the glass. Walter, too, was silent, his hands still working furiously on his drawing, the creak of his charcoal scraping against the paper like a low whisper. He hadn't looked up once. Liam's gaze returned to the window. The fog outside had thickened, the landscape growing darker with every passing second. There was no sign of any other stations, no lights, no other signs of civilization. It was as though the world beyond the train had vanished entirely. His chest tightened with unease. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice low. Sophia's eyes flickered to him, her lips parting as if she might say something but then falling silent. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nowhere. This train doesn't go anywhere. It loops. It's always looping." Before Liam could process her words, the train came to a sudden, jarring halt. The momentum sent him stumbling forward, his hand gripping the back of the seat for balance. The flickering lights above seemed to buzz more violently as the doors slid open with a low hiss. The station outside looked abandoned, its signage broken and unreadable. It was nearly identical to the last stop. Broken lights, crumbling platform, and a thick fog that clung to everything, swallowing any sign of life. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Liam's instincts screamed at him to stay on the train, but something compelled him to look outside. He stepped closer to the door, eyes scanning the platform. There was no one in sight, no other passengers waiting, no sign of movement. Only the thick, suffocating fog. Sophia moved quickly to his side, her eyes frantic. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to keep moving. It's better on the train." But Liam couldn't help himself. He needed to see it for himself, needed to understand. As he stepped toward the exit, he caught the briefest glimpse of figures moving in the fog, their forms blurred and indistinct. Suddenly, the conductor appeared again, his face impassive, his movements smooth and deliberate. He stood in the doorway, blocking Liam's path with his stiff posture. "Best stay inside," he said in his usual monotone. "This isn't your stop." Liam hesitated. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The conductor's voice had no warmth, no inflection. It was as though he were reading from a script, detached from the world around him. And those figures in the fog, they were moving unnaturally, jerky, as though they weren't quite human. "I just want to step out for a moment," Liam said, trying to push past the conductor, but the man remained unmoved, his cold eyes staring down at him. "It's not safe," the conductor repeated, his voice as cold as the steel of the train itself. "This is not your stop. Best stay seated." Liam stepped back, unwilling to argue further. He glanced at Sophia, who had her head down, her fingers tapping nervously on her backpack. Walter remained silent, his eyes focused on his sketchpad, as if nothing in the world could disturb him. But it was clear that something was wrong. The train didn't feel like it was moving forward anymore. It felt stuck. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. Liam could feel the tension building inside the cramped car. Suddenly, Walter's voice cut through the silence. "You don't understand, do you?" He looked up from his drawing, his eyes shadowed with something between pity and knowing. "None of us do." Liam turned to him, his pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" Walter's hands trembled as he flipped through his sketchpad. The pages were filled with drawings of the train, each one more decayed and broken than the last. But what stood out most was the way the train seemed to age in his sketches. The walls cracked, the windows shattered, and the seats fell apart into dust. "This place," Walter continued, his voice low and strained, "it traps you. You think you're just traveling, but you're not. You're stuck. We all are." Liam swallowed hard, his mind reeling. "How long have you been here?" Walter's eyes shifted away, his gaze unfocused, as though trying to remember something long buried. "A decade, maybe more. Time doesn't work the same here. It bends. It loops." Liam's stomach churned. A decade? More? His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the enormity of what Walter had said. The station outside had looked so familiar, so ordinary, but there had been no signs of life. No one to greet him, no one to confirm his place in the world. Just the train, constantly moving. But moving toward what? And for how long? Sophia turned sharply, her voice urgent. "We have to keep going," she said. "It'll get worse if we don't." Liam didn't know whether to believe her or not, but the weight of the uncertainty was heavy on his chest. He looked back at the platform one last time, his heart pounding in his throat. There was no going back now. The doors slid shut with a metallic clang, and the train began to move again. The fog outside rolled past, consuming everything in its path. The eerie silence returned, filling the air with an oppressive weight. Sophia pressed herself back into her seat, her eyes closed, her breath shallow. Walter turned the page in his sketchbook, as though nothing had changed. The lights above flickered, their dim glow barely illuminating the car. And, as the train sped off into the fog, Liam was left wondering if he'd ever find a way to escape. Liam leaned back against the cracked seat, his fingers tracing the edge of the worn leather as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. The train continued its relentless journey through the fog, its rhythmic clattering against the tracks almost hypnotic. It had been hours, maybe days, since the last station. Time seemed irrelevant here. He pulled out his phone once more, staring at the glowing screen. The clock was stuck at 12:43 a.m., the hands flickering erratically before resetting again to the same time. He had tried checking his messages, but every time he tapped on a notification, the screen would freeze, the message unreadable. His phone felt like a foreign object in his hands now, something that had long since stopped being useful. His mind began to swirl with questions. The train, the fog, the empty stations, they were all part of something far beyond his understanding. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Each turn of the wheels felt like a step further into a place he didn't belong. Walter's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're beginning to see it now, aren't you?" Walter said, his tone heavy with knowing. Liam turned to face him. Walter was sitting in his usual spot, sketching feverishly, the faint scent of charcoal hanging in the air. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, but his hands never stopped moving across the paper. "What do you mean?" Liam asked, his voice strained. "I don't understand. How long have you been on this train?" Walter's eyes lifted from his sketchbook, locking onto Liam's with an almost unsettling calmness. "Years. A decade, maybe more. I lost track after a while. But it doesn't matter. Time doesn't work the same here." Liam swallowed hard, the words sinking in like stones in his stomach. "So, you're telling me this train doesn't stop? Ever?" Walter smiled a thin, weary smile, his fingers still smudging the paper with dark strokes. "It stops for some, yes, but not for everyone. You think you're just passing through, but you're not. You're stuck, just like me, just like everyone else here." Liam's stomach tightened and he leaned forward. "What do you mean? What happens to us?" Walter's gaze turned distant, almost haunted. "Some of us stay because we're waiting for something, an answer, a way out. But there's no way out, not for us. The train, it keeps moving, and it doesn't care what we want." Liam's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Was he really trapped on this train forever? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time, though time had already stopped making sense. He glanced at Sophia, who sat across the aisle, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, as though she were trying to shrink into herself. He had seen this before in people. Desperation creeping in, slowly consuming them until they were nothing but shadows. Liam felt a sudden urge to ask her more, but he stopped himself. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth. The weight of the unknown was already too much to bear. Minutes, or was it hours, passed before Walter spoke again, breaking the silence. "The trick is to stop looking for answers," he said softly. "You'll drive yourself mad trying to figure it out. This place isn't about answers. It's about waiting." Liam couldn't understand what he meant. Waiting for what? He looked out the window, hoping for a glimpse of something, anything, that might give him a clue about where they were or where they were going. But all he saw was the thick fog, stretching endlessly, a wall of white that swallowed up everything else. There was no horizon, no sign of civilization, just fog, endless fog. Sophia stirred suddenly, her hand moving to her watch. Her eyes flickered with panic as she muttered to herself, barely audible. "It's almost time. I have to get off soon. I can't stay here." Liam glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about? Where are you going?" Sophia looked up at him, her face a mask of fear and confusion. "It's coming. The station. It'll be here soon. I have to get off." Liam felt his pulse quicken. Her words were nonsensical, yet there was a frantic urgency in her voice that sent a chill down his spine. Walter was still silent, watching her with a knowing look in his eyes, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Stay," Walter said, his voice cold and firm. "Don't go. You don't know what's out there." But Sophia was already standing, her body trembling with a mix of anticipation and terror. "It's the only way," she whispered. "You'll see. You'll understand when it's your time." Without another word, she hurried toward the door, her steps unsteady as she fumbled with the handle. The conductor appeared almost instantly, standing in the doorway with his usual blank expression. "Not your stop," he said in his emotionless tone, blocking the door with his body. Sophia stared at him, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. "I need to get off," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I have to." The conductor didn't respond, merely standing there as if waiting for something. Liam watched in a mixture of confusion and fear. Was this another one of those moments where passengers were faced with a decision? Did they get to leave? Or did they stay, condemned to wander the endless tracks forever? The conductor's eyes flickered toward Liam for the first time, his gaze cold and distant. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, allowing the door to slide open. Sophia didn't hesitate. She darted out of the train and disappeared into the fog. Liam stood frozen, staring after her. The door slid shut with a soft hiss and the train began to move again, its steady hum returning. He didn't know what to think. He didn't know what had just happened. "Was that her stop?" he asked quietly, turning to Walter. Walter didn't answer at first. He simply turned another page in his sketchbook, his expression unreadable. "She won't be back," Walter said, his voice low and filled with finality. "None of them do. Not once they leave." Liam swallowed, his throat dry. What had Sophia seen out there in the fog? What was so terrible that she had chosen to step off the train, to face whatever lay beyond the platform? He had no answers, only more questions. And the train continued to move, slipping further into the unknown. The train rocked again, and the sound of its wheels grinding over the tracks filled the air, louder now in the silence that followed Sophia's departure. Liam sat back down, the empty seat next to him a stark reminder of her absence. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, alone on the platform, swallowed by the fog. A strange weight had settled over him. The air in the car felt thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows, creating the illusion that the space around him was expanding and contracting. The train was no longer just a vehicle. It felt like a living thing, its pulse intertwined with his own. Liam rose from his seat, an instinctual need to move, to get away from the oppressive stillness. He walked toward the adjoining door, the metal handle cold under his fingers. As he pulled it open, a sharp screech echoed through the car, and he winced. The car beyond was just as desolate as the one he had left, but there was something different about it. The air felt stagnant, as if no one had stepped inside for a long time. He stepped through the threshold, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The car was empty, save for a few torn seats scattered haphazardly, their fabric worn thin by time. A musty, stale smell filled the air, mingling with the faint odor of rust and decay. The windows were covered with grime, the glass cracked in several places, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. Liam walked cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, the silence of the car suffocating. As he moved deeper into the compartment, something caught his eye. A piece of luggage, discarded and forgotten. Its leather was cracked and aged, the tag faded and unreadable. He bent down to examine it, his curiosity piqued. The bag was heavy, its contents shifting as he lifted it. He opened the zipper slowly, the sound echoing too loudly in the silence. Inside, he found an assortment of old clothes, each piece frayed and discolored by time. But what stood out the most was the photo album nestled at the bottom, its edges curling with age. Liam's fingers trembled as he flipped it open, revealing faded photographs of people he didn't recognize. The images were blurred, their faces half hidden in shadow, as though they were trying to escape the frame. He turned the pages slowly, each photograph more haunting than the last. People in various poses, some smiling, others staring blankly at the camera, their eyes distant. But what unsettled him most were the empty spaces in the background, places he couldn't quite place, familiar yet foreign at the same time. It was as if the people in the photos had been erased, replaced by the train itself. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the front of the car, a faint whisper followed by a muffled laugh. Liam froze, the album slipping from his hands and falling to the floor with a soft thud. He listened closely, straining to hear anything that might explain the sounds. It was coming from ahead, from the next car. He wasn't sure whether to go forward or retreat back to the previous one. But the whispering drew him in, a strange compulsion urging him to follow. His feet moved of their own accord, each step hesitant but determined. As he approached the door to the next car, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. He reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shiver up his spine. With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. The car was dimly lit, its flickering lights casting an eerie glow over the passengers seated within. But there was something wrong with them, something inhuman. Their faces were too still, their eyes too wide, as if they were frozen mid-motion. Their bodies were stiff, their hands clenched tightly in their laps, their mouths slightly open in frozen smiles. Liam stepped back in shock, his breath caught in his throat. These weren't people. They were mannequins, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their features too perfect, too lifeless. He couldn't understand why they looked so real, why they felt like something that had once been alive, but had been trapped in this place, forever suspended in time. One of the figures, a woman with a delicate silver necklace, seemed to shift slightly. Liam's heart skipped a beat. He stared at her, his mind racing. Was she moving? It was just his imagination, he told himself. The shadows were playing tricks on him. He took another step back, his eyes darting around the car, looking for anything that might explain what he was seeing. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like the wind howling through a broken window. Liam's pulse quickened, and he spun around, stumbling back into the previous car, desperate to escape the oppressive stillness. His mind was reeling. The question at the forefront of his thoughts. What was happening to him? He couldn't stop himself from moving further into the train. He had to know the truth, whatever it was. But the deeper he went, the more he felt the presence of something watching him, something waiting. Liam's gaze flicked back toward the door he had just passed through. The mannequin woman's eyes were no longer frozen in place. They were watching him, staring at him, unblinking, as though she had been waiting for him all along. He had to leave. He had to find a way off this train before it was too late. But with each passing moment, the train seemed to grow darker, more suffocating, as if it were slowly closing in on him. He didn't know what was worse, the fear of what he had seen, or the fear of what he would find next. The train rocked again, but this time the motion felt different, as if the world outside had shifted with it. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the air grew thicker, heavy with an impending sense of dread. Liam sat in the worn seat, his thoughts racing, trying to make sense of what he had seen in the car with the mannequins. But no explanation came. There was only a gnawing feeling of unease, like a dark pit in his stomach. He glanced at Walter, who was still sitting in the corner, scribbling furiously on his yellowed paper. His hands moved with a strange urgency, as if he were trying to capture something that was slipping away from him. Liam's eyes narrowed as he studied the older man. Walter had been on this train for years, but what had he meant when he said the train never really stopped? How could someone stay on a train for so long? And why hadn't anyone else gotten off, as Sophia had so desperately tried to do? Liam's mind buzzed with these questions, but they were quickly interrupted by the shrill screech of the train's brakes. The sudden jolt sent him forward, and he caught himself on the edge of the seat. The air felt colder, more stifling, as the train slowed to a stop. Walter didn't look up from his drawing. "You should stay seated," he muttered without emotion, as though he had predicted the train's abrupt halt. "The stops don't mean what you think they do." Liam ignored him, pushing himself to his feet. He glanced toward the door, then back at Walter. Something wasn't right. The station outside the window seemed wrong. It was bathed in an eerie fog, the edges of the platform indistinct and blurry. There was no sign of life, no movement, just the emptiness stretching out into the unknown. He stepped cautiously toward the door and pressed his face to the window. The fog outside swirled, thick and unyielding, and he could barely make out the outline of the platform. As the train came to a halt, a few shadowy figures moved along the platform, their forms disjointed, jerking unnaturally as they walked. Liam's breath caught in his throat. They weren't human, not fully. The way they moved, like they were trapped in some kind of strange, disjointed dance, made him feel as though he were watching a nightmare play out in front of him. The door to the car opened with a sharp hiss, and the conductor appeared in the doorway, his face as impassive as always. He glanced at Liam, his eyes cold and unreadable. "It's best to stay inside," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an order. "This isn't your stop." Liam opened his mouth to protest, but hesitated. There was something in the conductor's gaze, something that made him feel like a child being reprimanded. He stepped back instinctively, his heart racing. But before he could retreat completely, a voice broke the silence. Sophia. She had appeared from the rear of the car, her eyes wide with panic. Her hands were trembling as she clutched her backpack, and her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. "Please," she begged, her voice strained. "You have to come with me. We can't stay here. It's not safe." Her eyes darted nervously to the window, where the shadowy figures had drawn closer. Liam's stomach twisted. He hadn't realized until that moment just how desperate she was. There was a fear in her eyes that went beyond the train, beyond the strange figures outside. "Sophia," he said quietly, "what's happening?" "What do you mean it's not safe?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the platform outside, her gaze unfocused, as though she were looking at something far away. "The station. It's not real," she whispered. "None of this is. I need to get off before it's too late." Her voice was breaking now, desperation creeping into every word. Liam felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. What was she talking about? He looked back at Walter, but the older man seemed entirely uninterested, continuing his sketching as though nothing had changed. Sophia took a step toward him, her eyes pleading. "Please, you don't understand. If you don't get off soon, you'll be trapped here, like the rest of us." Her voice cracked as she spoke, her fear palpable. "You have to leave now." Liam shook his head. "I don't." But before he could finish, Walter spoke up, his voice low but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "She doesn't know," Walter said quietly, not looking up from his drawing. "None of them do." Liam turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" "What's happening?" Walter paused, his hand stilling on the paper for a moment. Then, slowly, he looked up, his eyes hollow and resigned. "It doesn't matter. No one gets off the train unless the train says so. The stops don't exist the way you think they do. They're just illusions. You think you're moving forward, but it's all the same." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "We're all trapped here. We always have been." Liam felt a chill run through him, his skin prickling with the weight of Walter's words. He turned back to the window, the fog outside swirling unnaturally, blocking his view. Sophia was still there, her face twisted in terror. The train screeched again, and Liam's heart skipped a beat. The doors opened, and Sophia bolted toward the exit. "I can't wait anymore," she cried. "I have to leave." Liam reached out instinctively, but the conductor stepped forward, blocking his way. "It's not your stop," the conductor repeated in his quiet, unyielding voice. But Sophia didn't listen. With a final glance back at Liam, she pushed past the conductor and leaped off the train, disappearing into the fog before he could call out. Liam stared after her, a sense of dread building in his chest. She had gone. But where? What had she found outside? He wanted to run after her, to follow, but something in his gut told him that leaving now would be a mistake. The train would leave without him, and the platform outside was not a place for someone like him to be. "She'll find her way back," Walter muttered softly, still staring at his paper. "They always do." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He glanced back out the window, but all he could see was the fog, thick and suffocating, swallowing everything in its wake. The train lurched forward, the shrill screech of its wheels on the tracks sending a shiver down Liam's spine. He turned to look out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophia was gone, vanished into the fog, lost to whatever dark fate awaited her on that empty platform. The train was already pulling away, the mist thickening and swallowing her figure whole. Liam's mind raced, questions swirling in every direction. Had she made a mistake by leaving? Was it even possible to escape this place? What had Walter meant when he said the train never really stopped? What if she was right? What if getting off was the only way out? He couldn't shake the image of Sophia, standing on the crumbling platform, staring helplessly as the train sped away. Her frantic expression was burned into his memory. Did she truly think she could escape, or had she simply given in to a desperate, final hope? He was shaken from his thoughts by Walter's voice, soft but insistent. "She'll be back," he said, his tone almost detached, as though the whole thing was just another part of the endless cycle that ran through the train. "They always are." Liam swallowed hard. He couldn't ignore the cold truth in Walter's words. This place, this train, was a kind of purgatory. No matter how far you went, no matter how many stations you passed, you always ended up back where you started. There was no way out. The car felt smaller now, suffocating. The air was thick with mildew and the scent of rust. Time had no meaning here. How long had it been since they had started this journey? Hours, days, weeks, months, years. It didn't matter. The train wasn't bound by any rules of time. It existed outside of them, stretching endlessly into an unknowable future. Liam's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, startled, to find the conductor standing in the doorway of the car. His face was as blank as always, his posture rigid and formal. "This is your stop," the conductor said, his voice low and almost apologetic. Liam blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I didn't—" The conductor raised a gloved hand, cutting him off. "This is your stop," he repeated. "You've reached the end of the line. Liam's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The end of the line? Was this it? Was this where he was supposed to get off? He glanced at Walter, who was still absorbed in his drawing, his eyes distant and unreadable. "I'm not ready to leave," Liam said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what's out there. I don't—" "You have to decide," the conductor interrupted gently, stepping closer. "This train doesn't wait. It never does." Liam hesitated, his mind screaming with uncertainty. He wanted answers, wanted to understand what was happening, what had happened to everyone on this train. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt himself slipping into the same apathy that seemed to consume the others. How many more people had come and gone before him? How many had resigned themselves to the endless ride? The conductor didn't wait for a response. With a quiet nod, he stepped aside, revealing the exit. A faint, flickering light beckoned from beyond, but it wasn't the warm, inviting glow of daylight. It was pale and lifeless, like the dim bulbs that hung over the station platforms. It was as if something was waiting for him, something that would pull him into its depths. Liam stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Could he really leave? What would it mean if he stepped off the train? What if it wasn't the end at all? What if it was just another illusion, another stop in the endless cycle of this cursed journey? Walter's voice came to him again, quiet but steady. "You don't have to get off," he said, his voice lacking the usual bitterness. "But if you stay, it'll get harder. You'll lose yourself in it, just like I did." Liam turned to face Walter, who now looked up at him for the first time. His eyes were weary but kind, and there was a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. A glimmer of hope, perhaps, or resignation. "You've been on this train for so long," Liam said, his voice heavy with understanding. How did you keep going?" Walter sighed, lowering his gaze to the paper again. "I didn't. I just kept waiting. Waiting for something to change. But nothing does. The train keeps moving, and you keep moving with it, whether you want to or not." Liam stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "And you think I'm ready to get off?" Walter didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, as though he knew something that Liam didn't. "You're ready," he said finally, his voice soft. "But you have to make that choice yourself." Liam stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with indecision. Then, with a final, steadying breath, he stepped toward the door. He paused just before stepping off, his hand resting on the cold metal frame of the door. The train's wheels screeched against the tracks, and the hiss of the door's closing echoed in his ears. He didn't look back. There was no point in looking back. He stepped off the train and into the unknown. The world outside the station was bustling, familiar landmarks surrounding him in every direction. The noise of a busy city drifted through the air, and the sharp scent of exhaust and fresh rain filled his lungs. It was so real, so vivid, that for a moment Liam wondered if he had dreamed everything that had come before. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, heart in his throat, and saw the missed messages. Dozens of them. Messages from friends, family, work. The last one, though, was the most jarring. It was from himself, sent just hours earlier. It read, "I'm just waiting to board the train. Don't let me forget." Liam's chest tightened as the realization hit him. He had missed something. He didn't know how long he had been gone, but it was longer than he thought. With a final glance at the train platform, Liam squared his shoulders. He would face whatever came next. He had a second chance. It wasn't the end, it was a beginning, and he would make it count.